It was an interesting exercise, revisiting my work and looking at it specifically through the lens of spatial justice. And I find that the description of the Van Eesteren Foundation, spatial justice as leverage, design research as enabler, is a very useful lens to look at architectural practice. So you will see that I use the term informality in my research to describe the formal-informal interface in the title slide. And the typographic device of the square brackets enable me to mesh the formal and the informal into one concept, striving towards an understanding that is more than a continuum, which implies two opposing poles. I'd like to start with my research of positionality, using it as a disclaimer of sorts. I'm an architect first. I've got undergraduate training, which has got a professional practitioner focus in architecture. I'm a registered architect. After that, I studied Africa Studies at master's level, focusing on urban and rural development. And lastly, with Carolyn as one of my panel of examiners, completed my doctoral research in architecture and human geography as a joint degree between Hasselt University in Belgium and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So combining discipline-specific knowledge from the field of architecture with a transdisciplinary point of view, courtesy of the discipline of human geography. I'm employed at CPUT as a lecturer in the Department of Architectural Technology and Interior Design. So my day-to-day work involves imparting discipline-specific knowledge and developing students' discipline-specific skills in the context of a profession that is inextricably linked to the capitalist economy and to the persistent spatial legacy of apartheid urbanism, which has shaped the South African urban context. However, I engage in research and situate my architectural student projects in contexts that enable an engagement with the real city and the real world, not the idealized city of the modern movement, where one could argue the dichotomy of the formal and the informal has originated, but rather the complex, contested, and messy real-world city of the developing world. And the image on the screen is a good example of this. You can tell from the horizon line that it is close to Cape Town. And the building in the foreground is the Dunoon Public Library, a building that I've been using for recent research as a precedent, completed in-house by the City of Cape Town Local Authority in 2019. And for me, this building exemplifies what is required of our profession in order to promote spatial justice. Dunoon is a formal planned settlement that was established 25 years ago, soon after democracy, and since was subject to massive informal growth, both as sprawl on the perimeter, but to a larger extent densification. In other words, informal development within a planned or a formal setting. And you can see on the left hand of the photograph the extent to which informal infill has happened. Informally constructed self-built shacks from tin. So successful intervention in such contexts, from the point of view as a professional architect, begins with accepting and understanding the nature of the formal-informal interface, which is quite challenging from a career that is centered in the formal. I'd like to discuss two guiding ideas that inform my work, but firstly I want to take you through these three quotes which has informed these guiding ideas from Abdulmalik Simone and Edgar Peterser. Simone talks about African cities that are characterized by incessant flexibility, mobile and provisional intersections where residents operate without clear notions of how the city is to be used or inhabited. These intersections have depended on the ability of residents to engage complex combinations of objects, spaces, persons, and practices, and as such become a platform providing for and reproducing life in the city. Peterser continues and describes urbanism and the existential core thereof as the desire for radical change to bring all the good implied in the original utopian association of the city or the urban. He states that this radical impulse stands in contrast to the necessary prudence and constraints of incremental change, and that incremental change is the only way of intervening in conditions of profound complexity and entrenched power dynamics. Operating in the scale or in the context of the urban as an architect, I understand this idea of incremental change very well, changing the city one building at a time. Peter goes further in another publication to say that the trick then is not to get lost down the rabbit hole of transgressive insurgency. One can say that is the informal, nor to remain stuck in the straitjackets of professional norms and codes, very much the realm of the formal and the profession of architecture. The challenge then is to hold the tension between these two poles with an eye on finding contextual solutions that work now and also add up to structural change in the future. And this is the core of the research that I will be presenting today, looking at architectural interventions and how they build up to structural change, not only on the urban scale, but more pertinently for me, in the profession of architecture. So getting back to the two guiding ideas that inform the work that I'll be presenting today. The first is informality with square brackets, which I've explained before. And I use that as a dialectic whole to replace the dichotomy of formal versus informal. And looking at informality in this manner enables architects to see the formal in the informal, to appreciate that informal spatial practice, that of informal settlement residence, is a legitimate and constructive form of urbanism. The second guiding idea is that of grounded architectural practice. And I use grounded architectural practice as a unit of analysis that draws attention to the patterns which emerge in relation to the nature of practice as an activity, as well as to the competencies and capacities that architects employ in their interaction with informal settlement residents and local government officials. I find that the diagram on the screen is very useful to explicate these different levels. So I use socio-technical transition theory as a lens through which to engage with urban development. And it's a multi-level perspective which helps me to explicate the impact of informality on architectural practice. So to start at the top of the diagram, on the landscape level, concerns such as sustainable urbanism, which includes spatial justice, operate on the level of the landscape, the macro level. Then moving one level down to the meso level, or the level of the regime, one can posit that architectural practice operates on this level. And then lastly, at the lower level, the level of the niche, is what I term grounded architectural practice, a niche innovation which has an impact on the regime. And then lastly, as one has system innovations that respond to these landscape developments. So grounded architectural practice at the level of the niche can be construed or understood as a system innovation that then alters the structure of the regime of architectural practice as it responds to landscape developments. So I'm going to start my discussion with the regime level, looking at architectural practice. Architect's activity is defined by prescribed professional competencies, and these competencies relate to a number of elements: architectural design, contextual urban and environmental relationships, construction technology and building services, architectural history, theory and precedent, contract documentation and administration, computer applications, and lastly, office practice, legal aspects, and ethics. And this is really the realm in which I engage in my everyday teaching, conveying these competencies to architectural students. I employ three theoretical perspectives to inform my exploration of the regime level architectural practice in the context of informality. The first of these perspectives is dialectic urbanism, which sees the urban not as a collection of built artifacts, but as a complex set of social relations, both formal and informal. And these relations are fraught with ambiguity, contradiction, and conflict. This draws on the work of Andy Merrifield. And these relations are further constrained by rigid institutional structures of local government and complicated by the formal procedures and instruments that shape urban space and architectural practice in particular, drawing on the work of Sue Parnell. The image on the screen is an aerial photograph taken not far from the CPUT campus where I work on a daily basis. And it shows the remnants of the District 6 street pattern, a neighborhood subject to race-based forced removals during the 1960s and 70s. Superimposed on that scar, you can see modern movements, highway infrastructure, and also the desire lines of walkways in contemporary use. So it's clear that these conflicts have still not been resolved, although there are a small degree of housing developments taking place over the past decade. Both the previous image and the one on the screen at the moment is from the Unequal Scenes photo series by Johnny Miller. And this shows the sharp contrast between planned and unplanned, or formal and informal settlement. This photograph also, coincidentally, one of the case studies that I did in a settlement in Guguletu towards the right. The second idea that I use is that of counter-conduct, which draws attention to the actions of residents in response to that of local governments, clearly seen in this slide, drawing on the work of Michel Foucault and contextualized in Cape Town by the work of Ruth Massey. Counter-conduct is understood as an after effect of power, and in the context of informal settlement upgrading, it often manifests as the perceived return to informal spatial practice as residents reinstate their livelihood strategies. You can clearly see that on the first photograph I showed you of the Dunoon Library and the informal dwellings erected in the courtyard of the library. And then the third idea that I use is that of self-organization, which focuses on the action of residents themselves, independent of that of local government. In the context of urban development processes, self-organization is a social innovation that involves vision and action building to stimulate sustainable improvements in the economic, physical, social, and environmental conditions of urban environments that are undergoing change. This is from the work of Weizke Boonstra. In the image, you can see a double-story structure, which is the process house by a community-based organization in Sweet Home Farm, quite close to Cape Town, called Ubushle Baka Ubushle, or Ubu. They promote empowerment and self-built housing typologies, double stories allowing for incremental growth from a single-story structure to a double-story structure, constructed by residents themselves, using sandbag and timber frame technology. This provides residents with an acceptable standard of enclosure and also satisfies the formal regulations, as the construction system has an Agrema certificate, which links it into the formal system of building regulations in our country. So following on from the three theoretical perspectives that informed my exploration at the regime level of normative architectural practice, I then go on to explore the niche level, grounded architectural practice, or GAP, as an emergent mode of architectural practice. In order to do this, I use live projects as a data collection tool. Live projects are a particular type of project quite prevalent in architectural practice over the past decade, which entails the negotiation of a brief by a real client in a real world setting, placing students or facing students with the real world problem. And it is a form of engaged scholarship that enables researchers to focus on everyday actions and negotiations. I employed 3 case studies of informal settlement upgrading where architects were involved, and this was the empirical component of my doctoral research. The analytical framework that I employed was that of third-generation activity theory. Activity theory is attuned to the conflictual nature of social practice and speaks about the contradiction-driven development of activity, or the idea that activities develop as they encounter problems and contradictions, and then develop through the resolution of these contradictions. Contradictions are understood as structural tensions that accumulate within and between activity systems, particularly when those activity systems represent the interface between the formal and the informal. Contradictions also often appear when new elements are introduced into an activity system. So it's a very appropriate concept for exploring architectural practice, a very formal activity in the context of the informal city. I'm not going to delve too much into the particulars of activity theory. I do want to show you this series of 3 diagrams. Third generation activity theory involves the construction of partially shared objects, or PSOs, as you can see on diagram 1 on the left-hand side. And these partially shared objects emerge between 2 interacting activity systems. So my research is concerned with the construction of partially shared objects between the activity systems of informal settlement residents and local governments. And upgrading interventions could be an example of a partially shared object. That's the central image on the screen. Third generation activity theory then assists in realizing residents' right to the city by providing a framework that recognizes their informal spatial practice as an activity system equivalent to and networked with that of local government. Moving to the right-hand side with the third diagram, grounded architectural practice then emanates from the boundary zone between the networked activity systems of residents and local governments. I've consciously not mapped grounded architectural practice as a separate activity system, but rather as embedded in or distributed across the activity systems of residents and local governments. Following on from the idea of contradiction-driven activity, another important concept in activity theory is that of knots. The making of knots, or knot working, entails the construction of constantly changing combinations of artifacts and actors in these networked activity systems, so as to resolve contradictions within and between activity systems, exactly where I have positioned grounded architectural practice. And Ilyo Engstrom describes knot working as rapidly pulsating, distributed, and partially improvised orchestration of collaborative performance between otherwise loosely connected actors and activity systems, and that these knots are continually tied and untied as the situation progresses. So in this version of activity theory, the third generation, the unit of analysis then shifts from the activity itself, looking just at architectural practice, to the unstable knots between activity systems, the interface between the formal and the informal. In my exploration of grounded architectural practice as a niche level activity, I then draw on a number of themes to inform the exploration, that of co-production, collaborative design, evolving professional knowledge, and capacities for subversive praxis. The photograph that you can see on the screen then is taken from one of the case studies for my doctoral research, where students engaged with residents to create a small timber pavilion. And this was one of the many meetings that we have had to work through the design with community input. I think what's very important to note with this, with all the case studies that I have used, is the role of intermediaries, non-governmental organizations, or community-based organizations, acting as an interface or translator, sometimes in linguistic terms as well, between residents and the architects and the students. The capacities for subversive praxis, which I've mentioned, originates in a publication by Edgar Pieterse and Frank Meintjes as a closing publication in a book entitled Voices of the Transition, The Politics, Poetics, and Practices of Social Change in South Africa, a publication done 15 years ago, 10 years after the advent of democracy. And I think it is informative to work through these 4 capacities for subversive praxis, which was originally developed in the context of development practice, and I appropriate them for architectural practice. The first is code switching between multiple registers of knowledge, formal and informal, and recognizing the power dynamics embedded in these different knowledges. To do so requires architects' presence in informal settlement contexts, spending time and effort to experience the social context and to understand that. The second is to adopt a multifocal perspective on architectural practice as a deeply political act that shifts power relations. I think this is very clear from the history of apartheid modernism, that architecture played a defining role in that movement. To understand the trajectories and linkages that bind together the multiple identities and affiliations that coexist in any informal settlement. Then self-reflexivity, the ability to recognize one's own projected desires in a development process, as based on an awareness of what Peterson calls the deeply inscribed psychological distresses that result from South Africa's history of arbitrary cruelty and terror, particularly in the realm of the spatial or the urban. And then the last capacity is being empirically informed and symbolically attuned. In other words, knowing what the facts are, objective facts are, and knowing what those objective facts mean to people in symbolic terms, developing an understanding of the phenomenological dimensions of each context. Then the last part of the presentation is to explore the impact of grounded architectural practice as a niche level phenomenon and how that impacts on the regime level. In other words, normative architectural practice and how it alters the structure of the regime. To do so, I've identified and described system innovations which occur in response to landscape developments, such as sustainable urbanism and spatial justice, and the impact that these landscape developments have on grounded architectural practice. Based on the empirical findings of the 3 case studies that I've engaged in, I've conducted a comparative analysis using the activity system mapping and diagrams and the contradictions and not working embedded therein with reference to competencies and capacities, and identifying patterns which have emerged across the 3 projects in relation to the nature of grounded architectural practice. I've presented this as tabulated data in my research and then reflected on each of the tables, giving a rich combination of quantitative and qualitative data, looking at the number of instances of contradictions and not working, but also looking at how the capacities and competencies were then used in this not working. The observations that I've derived from the comparative analysis includes the following. Grounded architectural practice derives from and engages with the residents' informal spatial practice and is deeply embedded in the activity and draws on multiple elements of both activity systems to resolve contradictions. In other words, drawing both on informal spatial practice and also on the activity of local government. Initiating formal interventions to support the informal initiatives of residents and their supporting local organizations are extremely challenging, as is the role of architects as intermediaries between these 2 systems, particularly taking into account the fact that architectural practice in its structure and standardized structure is not well suited for this type of activity, and architects have to figure out ways of embedding such engagements in their professional activity. It's important for architects to develop a comprehensive understanding of the partially shared objects between residents and local government, whether it be an in situ upgrading initiative or the construction of a public library, as we started with on the title slide. Having a comprehensive understanding of such partially shared objects enable architects to address contradictions that emerge in the activity in a way that respects residents' understanding of the partially shared object. In other words, advocating on behalf of residents. Architects also require relational agency to collaborate with residents in constructing such partially shared objects so that they encompass multiple perspectives, interpretations, engagements, and practices. Socio-technical facilitation is also an important component of GAP, grounded architectural practice, and has the potential to inform an entirely new category of professional competencies relating to participatory co-design processes, project planning and negotiation, architectural literacy and skills development, communicating with residents by virtue of models and not necessarily drawings, and then after completion of the architectural intervention, also building operation and monitoring, enabling residents and the community organizations to manage the building in the way it was intended. So in closing, returning to the theme of spatial justice, we need a redefinition of informality as a dialectic whole to replace the dichotomy of the formal and the informal. And this dialectic whole will allow us to a better understanding of the continuous production of urban space, both formally and informally, through top-down planning, as well as the everyday appropriations of residents themselves, and to contribute to such production of space in ways that are relevant and meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Revell, for this super interesting story. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions from the floor, but I'm just going to use my position here as a moderator to ask you for a first reflection. What I find really interesting is when you said in the end, as an architect or an urban designer, if we put it a bit broader, that you want to look at the sort of the shared objectives of both local residents and local governments. And I think that far too often we forget that there are shared objectives between these groups. Far too often we think that they have different sort of aspirations or objectives. And can you just elaborate a little bit on these shared objectives and how in your work you have sort of been able to use that as an element that brings a project further?
I think it's important to start when discussing this to look at the idea of that shared objectives are not necessarily existent at the onset of any engagement. With the case studies that I've referred to in this presentation, most of them came about as a result of service delivery protests or residents supported by community-based organizations or even NGOs demanding the attention of local government and putting their objectives in front of the door of local government. And then by virtue of that, local government engaged with the residents and they negotiated what the shared objective would be. So I think it is to a certain extent a degree of activism. Sometimes there are architects involved from the onset, sometimes architects are only engaged later on. To use a counterpoint to what I've just said, the library that I've showed you at the title slide in Dunoon was a project initiated by the city government of Cape Town. And so the project was initiated by them, and then they went through an extended process of community engagement in order to prioritize the needs and the desires of the community and the city. And then through that process arrived at the fact that the library will be one of the first projects that was to be done on that site. So I think it's important to note that it's not always a given. The core of my research is really to see how architects and architectural students in particular, because I work from a space of training, can be equipped with the necessary skills and be sensitized to the fact that they are going out into practice. And if they want to make a difference, they will have to engage with contexts where such projects can occur, working with local government, finding practices that do that type of work, or even engaging with that type of work as pro bono work, ideally through community-based organizations.
Thank you. I would really like to open the floor for questions. So please, if there are any questions turn on the camera or microphone and share your question. And of course, you can also put the questions in the chat.
While we wait for a question, I can perhaps say I see Jono Bennett is in attendance, and the work that he has done together with his lecturer Karen Combrink at the University of Pretoria was really instructive for my research from the outset, looking at one specific project in, I think it's a settlement called Slovo Park in Pretoria, and tracking in time a number of specific interventions, which I think also gives a particular richness, looking at the same context of development and following that over an extended period of time. Whereas my research was very much looking at snapshots in time and then engaging with the chronology of the occurrence through interviews with the people concerned.
And now, if please go ahead if you want to ask a question, but if there's not an immediate question, I wonder, what I always find very challenging is exactly if you work with students and you try to, or for yourself as well, if you have this different mindset of how you think planning or architecture should sort of become in the future. How is it for the students, this experience, and what are some kind of suggestions or guidelines or some advice that you can give? Because when you talk about pro bono work and so on, as an architect, in the end, you also have to make a living. So how do you deal with this tension?
Maybe I should start with the pro bono, and then I'm going to ask you just to remind me of the first portion of your question. The idea of doing pro bono work for me is extremely problematic. A lot of the literature reviews that I've done in my research speaks to the fact that these interventions, good case studies and examples of architects engaging in informal contexts, is ad hoc and on a pro bono basis, and that it's not a sustainable way of working. We cannot operate a profession, or particularly in Cape Town, in the context where a lot of practitioners are sole practitioners. It's just not feasible to scale the work up to the extent that is needed. So for me, and the research that I'm doing at the moment is looking at how one can define almost a separate set of not professional competencies, but a professional service, a definition of professional service, so that architects can be employed by either local governments or community-based organizations or NGOs, and they've got standard documentation that guides them through the process, but also enables them to make a living and to charge a fee for the vast amount of additional work which is required to operate intelligently in these contexts. To get back to the first portion of the question about working with students, I think at CPUT we're extremely fortunate that our student body is very closely aligned to the demographics of our society. So we have got a lot of previously disadvantaged students which bring their life experience into the classroom. And in particular, the live projects that I've engaged with in informal settlement contexts relied heavily on the contributions of these students, which was for myself and my fellow lecturers, and also for more advantaged students, which was a real learning opportunity. And I think it also has helped the previously disadvantaged students to really find their footing and to realize that you can build your identity as an architect on your life experience. So that was something that was extremely valuable. Also, as I mentioned, in community meetings, having students that are able to translate just words from English into isiXhosa to help resolve misunderstandings and such.
Yeah.
And I think that to a large extent is also a challenge which persists in our profession. that it's an extremely slow process in changing the demographics of our profession, and that people that engage in the profession, it's doing this type of work, like you say, it's not really a very profitable way of work. So you really are reliant on the proportion of the professionals that have got an appetite and a calling to engage in this type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions from the floor?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Adi.
Okay, but before that, I would like to thank Rudolf very much for his amazing lecture. Thank you so much. One thing is about, you mentioned the local government, but the local government, even on a local level, is not one monolithic whole. I don't know if you read the book recent book, Resisting Redevelopment by Eleonora Passotti, which is really amazing. But one of the things that she makes very clear is that success of resisting redevelopment project may depend on specific key persons. It might be one alderman, it may be the position of one high-placed civil servant. How is that in your cases in Cape Town? What is the role and the positions of various departments or even individuals in the local government?
I'm very glad that you raised this topic, because it's something that I thought that I wanted to mention and forgot.
Oh, great!
Our local government, particularly in Cape Town, it's a mixed bag of successes and less successful interventions. In the cases that I've looked at, there was always one person that came to the fore within the structure of local government, whether it was at the level of a ward, a specific area, or higher up in management. That was the one person that was the champion of the project and managed to force doors open where doors didn't want to open, and shoehorn the project through all the processes that it had to went through. I think it's particularly when you're working with an informal settlement, things such as the zoning of land, which is really something which is fiction on a certain level, but on the level of an informal settlement resident, zoning it's really not an issue. And where zoning of land became such an issue when we wanted to link the projects to the formal processes and systems, that you needed someone to make plans and ask for favors and exceptions in order to still follow the formal process, but make a building that is meaningful. So I think that's definitely something that is important to identify those key role players, not only on the level of an individual, but perhaps also looking at developing best practice in local government to see what it is that those people do, and how that dislodges contradictions in the activity systems.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Ari. Other questions?
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Caroline. Rudolf, thanks very much for your presentation. I enjoyed so much, and especially because I do kind of similar work in Central America. I work in El Salvador at the University of Central America in El Salvador. And I was thinking about in your presentation, you thought about engagement and time. And for us working in informal settlements, the question of engagement, definitely from the part of residents, it is there. For the part of government at different levels, it depends on the time frame they stay in the government. But in the case of the practitioners, and I'm talking about students and future architects, how do you manage to still be engaged even after our students graduate? How can they continue a lifetime work on informal settlements if that's their idea of the kind of work they would like to develop? Do you have some comments on that? Can you give us some advice? I talk about my own students. I think about my own students back in El Salvador and how do they engage in this kind of projects, which I think is very important for us to continue developing. Could you elaborate a little bit more? And thanks for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I wish I had an answer. I think that's the elusive answer or elusive question in everybody's research that is engaged in this type of practice. A couple of things come to mind. One of the case studies, the process house, the double-story structure I showed you on one of the slides, came about through a British architect that moved to Cape Town and through a faith-based organization became involved in the specific community of Sweet Home Farm. And then only a couple of years later, started becoming engaged in a professional capacity, helping people to develop this typology and familiarizing people with that typology. And it's been a process that has been unfolding over, I think it's probably about 10 years now. So that speaks to that idea of needing a presence, a sustained presence in a specific context, which makes it difficult if you take that into a practice that has to sustain yourself financially. A lot of the people whose work I've been following are people that, whether through local government funded projects or somehow else, became involved in communities, and then based on the relationships established during the first intervention, continued working with and for those communities. And then other examples where through NGOs that are appointed by the local government that are familiar with the community that work in that context. But you can see I'm fumbling around, I'm not answering your question. I think for me, my hope, and it's a rather naive hope, which I'm hoping to upgrade to something more practical through my career, is to see that if you equip students, and particularly students that are familiar with these contexts, that grew up in these contexts, if you equip them with a sensitivity and an awareness that architecture firstly has a moral responsibility to further spatial justice and an incredible potential on the scale of an individual building, you can make a massive difference, but it needs to be upscaled somehow. So I think I can continue giving you examples, but I'm not close to the answer that I think all of us needs.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your comments, and definitely we could continue developing this conversation further. Thanks, Rudolf.
My pleasure.
And we have a follow-up question from Jono, but maybe you want to pose it yourself.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Hey, Rudolf, thanks. It's a great presentation. I think the last question was really interesting, and I could see it from what you shared today. Like, and I was in our conversations long ago. You've done so much work around the ideas behind this and the kind of, like what are the bodies of knowledge that support these things. But to Sandy's question, I'm curious where you see the limits of the profession as like architect, capital A, versus the kind of discipline of like making architecture, especially with the fact that in South Africa, in the world, like 90% or like the majority of buildings are not built by professionals. So how do you sit around that sort of line of the limits of the profession to the opportunities of the discipline?
It's a pertinent question, and a question that inevitably arises in every presentation that I do. And I think I'm privileged in the sense that on top of my architectural training, I've been able to study development studies and human geography, which gives you a vastly different perspective Having grown up as an architect, I still feel that practitioners or professionals, whether it's architects or urban designers, landscape architects, have got a strategic advantage in that our professions, it's the profession and the level where implementation happens. And without implementation, you've got nothing. So backtracking from that rather egotistical statement, I think that is the problem, that architects, we come from a profession where which is very patriarchal, based on the idea of the solo architect, the modern master, and the people that engage in these types of projects are the architects that are aware that you are an extremely small cog in a big machine, and that you shouldn't enter any situation thinking that, operating from the realm of knowledge. I think that, and in my research, I've also seen that the skills and the competencies that architects have, limited as they are can be deployed very successfully in when engaging with informal settlement upgrading or the making of buildings in informal settlements. But it is a very small part of the total set of skills that are needed. Like I mentioned about socio-technical facilitation, which is a term that I stole off of your work. So I think to answer the question succinctly is that it is about working in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams and not trying to assume that you've got answers that you don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think well put, and I think Roberto also agrees. And I know that Roberto has an additional question, so please, Roberto, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll try to be brief. Thanks, yeah. Rudolf. I actually come from a very similar country to South Africa. I come from Brazil. Mm-hmm. And in Brazil, we have the fundamental question of how to engage students who come from different ethnicity, different race, and different social class with the problems of the oppressed, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And they have incredibly different lives, and they don't know how people live in slums, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And nevertheless, these people are going to be the people doing the policy for the slums later on. How do you guys tackle this? I noticed that many of your students were white, but how does it work?
I think the long and the short of it is that we rely on live projects, and we don't do live projects each and every year. It's something that I've done 4 years in a row as part of my research. And it's really about socializing students in informal contexts, exposing them to informal contexts. I think that's probably the best answer I can give you. Like I mentioned, we are privileged in the sense that we've got a more representative demographic in our student body than what you would have at more traditional universities. We are a university of technology. But I also think that students, just because you put a lot of people in the same room, or even worse, in an online space like we're having to teach now, those discussions and socializing doesn't necessarily happen. So I think it's reliant on the curriculum or the structure of the learning activities to stimulate such engagement and opportunities therefore. And then also lastly to, and I think it's something that we've been able to do in our department, if you get students that are interested in this type of work, to keep them on as junior academics. And we've been very fortunate in that we've been able to attract or retain a number of our Black students as junior lecturers, who subsequently went on to study urban design and other qualifications, which is a huge win for our department.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am looking at the time. We have like 4 more minutes, but maybe Asiya has a question. Asiya, you want to pose it? And I think then we have to close the session.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rodolphe, for the presentation, and thank you all for a very interesting discussion. I'm actually finalizing my PhD in Leuven on this very topic. So I was greatly excited that somebody else had worked on formal-informal interface. I have a lot of practice experience in this from Pakistan. I'm from Karachi. And one of the ways that we have tried to deal with it, not only in Pakistan, but also in some other parts of Asia or countries in Asia, is kind of looking at alternative practices through para-architects, actually. So you might be familiar with the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights or the Orangi Pilot Project, which are quite well known in the development sort of scene. So what they did was they actually took youth from the communities. So rather than relying on these kind of upper middle class students who often graduate with aspirations of a conventional practice, at a certain point in the 90s, they did this experimentation with actually working with the community youth. And that has been quite successful. And there's been a kind of courses designed, which the NGOs try to run themselves. And actually at the ACHR, they take young graduates, run them through a kind of training, and then they go back into the communities and work. But that has its constraints too. But I was just wondering if this was one alternative to professional practice, or kind of expanding the scope of formal-informal interface, which is rather than still staying top-down and bringing formally trained architects into the community or into the situation. If we already had a group which was, trained to some extent in this kind of work, and they could meet halfway, and there could be a more horizontal interaction.
Yes,
yes. This kind of top down. So that was my question, in fact, and the rest was just addition to what could be.
I think that's a very logical suggestion. The idea, and that's where I think the idea of socio-technical facilitation comes in. And in some of the cases that I've looked at, particularly the work of Baka Ubushle, that's exactly what they do. They have got youths from the settlement that they train with. I think it's very easy to take community members, youths or adults, and to sensitize them to spatiality and to the organizing of space and structure. So in that sense, the knowledge that we bring is not really that difficult to impart. It's facilitating that process of engaging with that knowledge to arrive at a context-specific solution. Something that I've found to be very useful is one of the person that started UBU, Barry Lewis, refers to the work of John Turner a lot, and to the movement that they had in the United Kingdom, where architects would engage in projects but take a complete backseat role. And his critique on that is that you're not using your full a set of tools or competencies, and that's also not a responsible way. It's a wasteful way to work, being in a situation and not intervening to your full capacity. So I think it's striking a balance between soliciting and eliciting responses from community members, empowering them to define their own needs and desires in spatial terms, so as to be able to implement that. I suppose that is a skill that you only hone with experience.
Yes, I think so, and I think because communities are so fast evolving, it has to be like that, and it has to kind of continue to be honed and developed. So this interaction, and I've witnessed it myself in the last 2 decades in my own practice, and it only gets better and more valuable. Because architects who come into the communities, they can keep coming in and leaving, but as long as there's a sustainable group within the community who continues to develop certain ideas and projects and programs with intermittent kind of interactions from university graduated architects, it can lead to a kind of more socially just professional relationship as well, and not just be doling out, instead of maybe charity technical advice, it becomes a more equitable relationship as well.
I think something that I've maybe not made as overt as I should have in the presentation was that in the projects that I've engaged with, and I think that's a very good model to assist architects that are new with this type of practice or don't have the luxury of sustaining relationships over long periods of time with specific communities, is the role of community-based organizations as intermediaries. And with many of these projects, the architects slot into these projects through these organizations. So even the architects that are new in these contexts get a crash course and understand a full understanding before they start engaging in the process as an architect. I think that's probably a key towards scaling up this type of practice, exploring that interface. And on a very mundane level, writing a code of architectural practice that enables architects to work in that way, kind of a memorandum of understanding, if you like, so that it's not always the exception or an ad hoc way of working.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's sort of nice because that moves toward, okay, how can we move from this niche to more accepted part of our profession. So Rudolf, I want to close this session and thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation with a lot of insights for students, but also for us practitioners. So thank you very much. Let's give a virtual applause.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.